Afternoon all. Let's continue our look at the evolution of chess style with another nice Alexander Alekhine game. This time he was black against Efim Bogoljubov. I think that's how Bogoljumov's name is pronounced. Okay, so these two had actually competed at the highest level for World Championship matches later, I believe. But interestingly also, this game played at Hastings 1922 was one of Irving Chernev's favourite games. Irving Chernev from 1900 to 1981, who is actually for me one of my greatest annotator inspirationals. You know, I really enjoyed his annotated games books, and one of the ones I really fell in love with was the most instructive games of chess ever played. But some of his other books were like really more popular, like Logical Chess Move by Move. But for me, that was one of my all-time favourites. So I really love his game annotations. He grasps the intuitive essentials, the enthusiasm of the game, what the game highlights strategically. And I think I did improve, my positional understanding as well as enjoy great games of chess with that book. And so we're stepping on one of his favourite games here. So Efim playing white, he played d4, and Alexander played actually the Dutch defence, so fighting from move 1. Apparently it might have been the last round of this Hastings, and Alexander needing a win. So the Dutch defence, a bit riskier than like a normal d5 or knight f6, going for a fight straight off the bat. Modern UK grandmasters in UK anyway, like Simon Williams, play it with great effect. And it's interesting actually, we reach a kind of classical variation of the Dutch defence, which is very much like a Simon Williams game actually with black. So we'll see how that emerges. c4, knight f6. And after g3, we have e6. Now the interesting thing here is e6 is usually for a Dutch stonewall, where black later plays d5 and c6. So he's got like that stone wall presented. And usually white's challenge is actually to exchange off this dark square bishop in the stone wall structure, just to emphasize these dark squares. But that's not the case here. We're going to be transposing in this game into a kind of Dutch classical actually, where black is not maintaining the bishop. In games of Simon Williams, the bishop would go here usually, and then after d6 castles, queen e8, the bishop could slip back to d8 to protect c7, and then black prepares e5. Interestingly, in this game, something different happens. Bishop g2, the bishop plays a check, and is gotten rid of now after bishop d2. So given this is the case strategically, black doesn't want to weaken dark squares now, so going into the classical is more in line with this bishop exchange. So black's strategy is to try and put pressure on these dark squares now. If black can castle knight c6, queen e8, and then try for e5, that would be a much better plan than the stone wall system, now that these dark square bishops have come off. So that's the plan which is adopted, knight c6, so immediately attacking d4. Knight gf3, doesn't want to play e3, weakening more squares, so knight gf3 just defending that pawn. Now both sides castle. Now we see this move d6, so we're getting a transposition into Dutch classical with the bishops not present, the dark square bishops. Now this next move may be a little bit artificial actually, although it has some logic. Puts the queen on the sensitive diagonal. It has created some vulnerabilities for white, and also of course blocking in the pawn. So black kind of gets his king with prophylaxis away from that sensitive diagonal. And now queen c3, okay, unblocking the b pawn, and the queen seems to be in a good place, but black's definitely getting nice central control now with this next move, making use of a very important tactic in the position. And also, when black wants to play for e5, usually it was without e6, so as though black lost time with e6, but is making this chameleon-like transformation into a normal-looking Dutch classical type position after e5. And this is made possible now because white cannot win this pawn. Take. At the end of all this, the knight's going to be in pre. That's the technical issue here, which facilitates this central controlling move. And when black usually gets in e4, black's doing fine, especially like in the Leningrad Dutches. That's a sign that black's definitely equalised. Now here, white is forced now to play a passive, horrible move really, e3, weakening some more squares. And black's certainly doing absolutely great now. a5, putting the brakes on white's potential queenside expansion with b4, which might be useful for dislodging this knight away from central control. b3, okay, keeping the option maybe later of a3 and b4. If a3 immediately, then a4 would be sealing up the white queenside. So now queen e8, which is a totally kind of standard stereotypical looking maneuver in the Dutch classical. But as I say, usually this bishop would have been maintained. There would have been a dark square bishop coming back here, but this is not the case. And it seems kind of very nice. All of black's pieces are very nice, no problem piece, except this guy potentially needs to be liberated at some point. So a3, and we've got a kind of caveman type hack attack system. So queen h5, what's next? Is it going to be like knight g4 and e4? That's kind of implied, just going from mate on h2. Now, an interesting looking move to sort of parry against crude threats on the king side is played now. And it looks unfortunate to have to play this, but it's probably difficult for white to consider much else. He plays the move h4. So he's clearly weakening g4. Now if the threat was seriously like knight g4 and e4, I wonder actually, looking at the position now, if h3 was tenable. But let's just add, let's do a Qb3 check with an engine. Apparently e4's doing nicely for black here, this kind of position. Okay, quick Qb3 check. So, okay, maybe white's preferred the look of h4. But we do get this kind of weakness now with h4, this g4 square, which is always nice for a knight now on coming to g4 like here. So black is also with knight g4 keeping control, an eye on e5 against that queen and that pawn and this knight. So both these knights are taking care of e5. White doesn't really want to release the tension with d5. The knight could slip back and then black gets a free hand on the queen side. You can imagine that sort of stuff later, and there'll be a slaughter of the white king. So instead, actually, knight g5 is used with the idea, of unblocking the pawn, maybe to evict this knight now. Bishop d7 is played, and now the knight's evicted from g4. But white remains in difficulty here. He's moving too many pawns, it seems. This next move, f4, clearly does weaken the g4 square again. And after e4, also now the bishop is being shut out of the game. So it's not particularly pleasant from a positional perspective. But Alexander needs to kind of have more than the white king to attack here. And he shows great flexibility and versatility in being able to switch attack to the other side of the board pretty soon, actually. Now this is like blocked up, and he's accumulated a certain advantage on this side of the board. So namely, the blocked-in bishop, the weakness of the g4 square. This pawn is going to be vulnerable as well. It's kind of backward behind the other pawns, and that could echo in some variations coming up. So what does Alexander do though to increase his advantage now that the king side is blocked up? After rook fd1, he kicks away that knight on g5 first, and now he occupies actually the centre, dares to occupy the centre a little bit more. But here, white dare not take on d5 here, because knight takes d5 will be exposing that e3 pawn with tempo. So knight f1, it looks like a miserable position for white here. Knight e7, okay, and now another weakening pawn move, this time on the other side of the board. It seems white's been totally discouraged from b4, because black can always play takes and then capture the d5 square with a knight, hitting e3 just with unpleasant pressure. So actually white is content to try and seal up the queen side now. Now that the king side's been locked up, the queen side's been locked up now with a4. So maybe, you know, black just wanted the draw. He wanted to try and create some sort of fortress position. But, you know, look at these squares, this g4 one and this b4 one, both terribly weak, with pawns not able to sort of assist in evicting pieces now. So knight c6, the knight's coming to b4 now. So white's getting outplayed quite badly positionally. And now this queen is showing great versatility from the centre. The magic of the centre, just queen e8, magically immediately targeting another side of the board, actually the a4 square. And this becomes very important after this next move. White plays rook g2. There's hardly going to be a kingside attack here. It will take some preparation, you know, like knight f2, g4, but even then, you know, so what? So black is able to now really start capitalizing on the pressure on the queen side now. He plays d takes c4, and this is a very difficult position now. He's going to lose this pawn because the alternative is not very palatable here. Queen takes c4. If queen takes c4 was played, then knight fd5, forwarded by that knight on b4, hitting that vulnerability e3, and say queen e2, then an energetic move like c5 would bust open the position and really expose this kind of huge congestion white has with all these pieces huddled over here. Because you can imagine d takes c, rook c8, and as well as fierce queenside, you know, pressure on the c file, the knight can come to d3. Black would stand massively better here. So Efim is wanting to minimise his losses, so he just loses the a pawn instead. So he takes with the b pawn here. So after bishop takes a4, now knight f2, carrying on with his not so threatening kingside attack. Bishop d7, so the passed pawn is ready to start queening soon. Okay, there's a few things in preparation of that first though needed, like this vulnerable knight, something to do about this vulnerable knight. Knight d2, but that's sorted out now. The knight is given the opportunity to try and get onto the d5 square with this next move, b5. Because if it takes, then, you know, knight could step back or just be reinforced with this knight coming to d5. So white didn't take on b5. White played knight d1, very unpleasant position, and he's allowing, you know, the black knight to come to d3 if black wants, which actually black uses now, knight d3. And in fact we've got potentially two huge connected pass pawns coming up with tempo after b4. But the clever thing about this knight d3 is tactically, hasn't white just left the pawn on a5? Was that a tactical inaccuracy? Well, actually this is also used in a lot of middle game books now. This is the start of a magnificent and beautiful combination. After rook takes a5, Alexander has a stunning idea here. An absolutely stunning idea, and it shows actually how knights are not particularly good, as well as bishops sometimes, at handling passed pawns. I think that's how it's being used in middle game books, this position, the start of this combination. So b4. Now if what white's reasonable move here you might consider is Queen A1, but maybe, you know, black stands still a lot better in this position if this had been played. I believe with rook takes and queen takes, let's do a quick engine check, but I think it's black, you know, dominates the queen side here, and that a file is pretty critical after queen A8. So this will be pretty nasty for a rook invasion, and we've got a menacing pass pawn here. So like this pass pawn will be very, very, you know, dangerous here, especially with this easy a file access. So this is a very, very unpleasant position, leading to white's collapse actually by force. This type of variation. Okay, so you can imagine a move like rook c2 now, and very, very unpleasant. So let's get back to the main game. White didn't want to do that. After this b4, white thought, hold on a sec, I can take the rook here, and then move the queen, surely. The thing is, after rook takes, Alexander did not play queen takes a8. He doesn't need to. He can sacrifice his rook with check, believe it or not, and that's his beautiful conception here. After b takes c3, rook takes e8, he's not losing his dangerous pawn here. His dangerous passed pawn he's maintaining now with a stunning rook sacrifice. He plays actually not rook e8 but c2, and it's a whole rook sacrifice with check. With check. What can stop now that black pawn on c2 in this position? After check, king h7, white is helpless against that passed pawn, queening. So Efim played here, knight f2, and the pawn's queening with check. So again, Alexander, he's got a winning advantage here now. And the rest should become easier. First he attacks the rook on g2. Then he wins that c4 pawn. And, you know, look at the congestion of the white pieces. It's just terrible. It's almost as bad as one of the worst Karpov-Kasparov games, the congestion over here. So rook b8. And now bishop b5, creating a battery and a horrible threat to parry on f1, because if bishop g2, then there's knight takes g2 and queen f1. So black is winning further material, forcing white to play this rook takes b5 just to parry that threat. So queen takes b5, and this is hardly a threatening attack now after g4, but white wants to try and loosen e4. But check is pretty nasty stuff now, where white is getting okay, a pawn temporarily, but this is just horrible. Queen e2, and white's in a kind of horrible zugzwang type position pretty soon. In fact here, you know, if the discovered attack doesn't work for similar terrible reasons to do with passed pawns, because knight takes is winning here. You know, rook takes, pawn takes, and there's no king f2, and the knight again cannot defend against e1 in this position. So this use of pawns against knights in this position is really in evidence in even the variations. So d5 from white, king g8, and white's, you know, being run out of moves because of that idea. You know, he's just in zugzwang basically. You know, if the rook moved off here, then knight g4, and then if knight takes, then there's queen g2, mate. You know, something like this. There's knight g4. So white's in knots. You know, if takes, then queen g2. White's totally in knots, and Alexander's like just running him out of useful moves until he's forced to play e4, and now Alexander can of course just take that, leaving white's pawn structure not the best. These isolated pawns, double pawns, not the best pawn structure ever. So rook and knight are hardly a match for the queen in this position. After d6 losing another pawn, f6 losing another pawn, rook d2, more sadism to do with passed pawns and vulnerable, ineffective knights now with Queen E2. It wasn't even needed, but this is a neat simplification. Black's totally winning now. He could have just taken on F4, but he's echoing like the theme of the game, this idea of really dangerous passed pawns against stumbling knights, basically. So rook takes E2 takes, but the king can come to the rescue here, of course, with King F2, but it leads to a totally lost king and pawn ending now. So after D5 check, White resigned. King F5 is just going to be munching these pawns pretty soon. So in terms of beauty, yeah, there's a beauty because of the power of passed pawns and how pieces are just getting in the way and tied in knots in this game. There's also a chameleon type transposition into a kind of classical variation of the Dutch without the dark squared bishops. Very key move in this game, I think, was E5, establishing good central control, good basis for a crude looking attack. Advantages accumulated on the king side, like the G4 square, are sort of stored and used for later reference, because Alekhine turns its attention to the queen side, where he picks up a pawn, picks up the menacing, hugely menacing, dangerous B pawn, which wins the game with a beautiful combination. So let's look at the game in summary and overview. So Dutch defense, chameleon type transposition into the classical variation, but without the dark squared bishops. So Black being able to equalise comfortably in terms of central control fairly soon with this very important tactical move E5, just exploiting vulnerability of this knight on D2. So White's being forced into a passive position pretty soon. The brakes have been put on B4 for queenside expansion, which could knock out a bit Black's central control, B4, B5. So now with a safe position in the centre, this flank attack seems to be quite justified. Queen E8 to H5 here, justified in this position. And a move like H3, if it's answerable with E4, Black's just gaining a lot of space in the centre, after with D5, and locking out this bishop on G2, really. So H4, trying to sort of minimise the damage on the king's side, but advantages are being accumulated here. That G4 square is very vulnerable. So in White trying to sort of kick away that knight to have to play F3, it's fairly unpleasant here, this position, because moves like H6 and F4 are now on the cards, liberating this bishop. If this knight has to go back here, then it's going to be vulnerable in variations. So it was decided best to minimise the damage again, F4. So he leads to one clear square weakness, G4, on the king's side, and now the ceiling also of the bishop. So we're getting these huddled pieces now on the king's side, really being tangled on the king's side very awkwardly. But the beautiful thing now, the symphony is conducted now on the other side of the board. The queen side starts to be the arena of the attack. With that central control still evident, it's being used again now for a queen side pressure. But also A4, another compromising the B4 pawn. B4 square rather, so a knight coming to the B4 square, and now a battery against A4. Of all squares on the chessboard, you wouldn't have thought A4 is that important, but here this bishop and queen battery is actually quite dangerous in this position, because White's got all these other vulnerabilities like E3 in these variations, so he can't easily do something about D takes C and knight D5. He's got to be careful about that. So actually A4 is really vulnerable in this position. White's just been totally positionally outplayed and put in knots, and these stumbling knights look pretty drunken at the moment, but their drunkenness is used as a point of humiliation in this game in relation to passed pawns being unable to parry the simplest of passed pawns pretty soon. So rook G2, and now Black takes, winning basically the A4 pawn, because the alternative is just unpalatable. Queen C4, something like knight D5 followed by C5. It's really unpalatable. So White loses the A pawn. But now, it's not straightforward to try and queen that A pawn. But there's a beautiful concept now, tactically, that this previous positional play gives rise to, like, you know, a flower blossoming, and you know that's the nature of a lot of Alekhine games. You know, you see the evidence of him first strategically crushing the opponent, and then there's this beautiful tactical combination, flowering out of the good position. So here, knight d1, and the start of the combination now with knight d3, just offering seemingly innocently the a pawn. But the conception of this is to actually leave a rook hanging with check pretty soon. So after rook takes a5, not rook takes a5 here, b4. So content to give up, you know, all of his back row. These pieces are all going to be sacrificed here. So after rook takes a8, takes on c3. Okay, he's got his queen back, but he's losing an entire rook now with check by playing c2. But he's exposing these like drunken knights that really, you know, they were stumbling before, and now they're just humiliated with this passed pawn here after c2. So a rook being offered with check, and there's nothing white can do about this pawn queening. So after knight f2, with the pawn queening, and white's pieces now still tied in knots, you know, visually extremely embarrassing, this position. And Alexander is winning now more material, even more after bishop b5. If the knight moved, I think, you know, maybe just queen c3, just hitting that e3 again, e3 would echo as a weakness again. So white giving up the exchange. After g4, it's not really much of a game for white now. This move kind of is really embarrassing, this queen e2. Just to one side, I think knight g4 with knight takes g4. So white's tied in knots, and now, you know, run out of moves basically, with these king moves, just waiting for black to further compromise. Sorry, for white to further compromise his position. So he plays e4. And now that's just taken, and the rook and knight versus queen is just hopeless. He's giving out his pawns. He might as well have resigned, and but now there's further humiliation in terms of that theme of the game. These dangerous passed pawns against knights, leading to a very simplified and easily winning king and pawn ending. Okay, so we're getting this flavour in terms of style that Alexander Alekhine was a master of positional play and tactics, and his combinations did flow like a flower flowering from his great positional play beforehand. So he's tying, you know, opponents in knots. But that, you know, that's kind of consistent with some other great players like, you know, Nimzo-Dutch. You know, sometimes he would completely positionally crush people first and then tactically take them out. You know, sort of prophylaxis before the attack. But here, this was great. You know, this is like really powerful looking game and very attractive. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks so much.